Welcome back to another Agency Connect one-on-one. I'm Sunir Shah, president of the Cloud Software Association and CEO of AppBind. I'm here with Rob Pierson of Piercing Digital. I love that name. Who has an amazing bespoke agency near and dear to my heart, because you're also doing analytics and CRO consulting, like conversion rate optimization consulting, like I used to do. And maybe I wasn't as good as you are, because now I have my own company, because I got fired by a client because I screwed up so badly that we can talk about that. But you have quite the interesting stable of clients and projects. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and thank you for being here.
Sure. Great to be here. Thank you. So I run a small digital marketing agency that largely works with startups with traction as well as nonprofits, generally medium nonprofits. I got my start working in Washington, D.C. in Congress, helping members and staff learn to use social media back in 2006 or so. Worked there for about a decade and then started working for brands and a couple agencies. And then I eventually started my own agency, and that's where I'm at today.
The fact that you have agency experience and led to your agency is kind of interesting because, and then you started in 2006. Now, the other thing that rang my bell is I also ended up in marketing via politics when I worked in Parliament Hill for John Manley in his campaign for the leader of the party back then. I learned a lot about this kind of relationship marketing, and also, when you do relationship marketing, it leads you to being, I think, empathetic as an agency, because everyone has feelings all the time, and your job is to bring it under control. Somehow clients are always freaking out, and that's kind of politics, and I kind of learned that from that. It actually leads to the first question. So the whole point of this podcast is, if you can't bring the digital under control, you can't get the agency under control. But the person who's the most at heart of that is the customer. They're always freaking out, they're in chaos, they come to you for help. In their words, what would you say their pain and suffering is? Their fear that they came to you. What are you taking care of it for them? From their point of view?
I'd say a big part of it is learning how to prioritize their time and their effort and capital. Which aspects of the funnel do they focus on? Which aspects are the leakiest, and what areas have the greatest opportunities for growth with the least amount of effort? So putting some order into that chaos and then executing on those strategies with effective tactics, plus being able to report back on what's working and then iterating based on where your efforts are most useful.
One of the things, I don't know if lots of people understand the analytics and conversion rate optimization field. Like, obviously I worked in it and it's near and dear to my heart. But one of the interesting things is the marriage of computer science, math, and analysis to results. Can you tell us a little bit about what the technical skills you bring into a project? Because it seems like magic, I've discovered, to most clients, like what we're doing. Like, can you reveal the trick, how the magic trick works? Like, what are you actually doing tactically that the client may not appreciate to deliver them outcomes?
Sure. On the analytics side, I guess the thing that really is most salient is figuring out what metrics really matter and making sure you're tracking them effectively, which can get really difficult, particularly as you're tracking across multiple tools. If, for example, a visitor comes in from a Facebook ad, then they go to your website, then they go to a type form, and finally become a customer through a Stripe integration in Gravity Forms through WordPress. How do you measure that, particularly if it's going through multiple domains? And then how do you track multiple visits to make sure that you're treating that visitor as a single visitor rather than as multiple visitors when they're a single person? Putting all of that into place is a really key part of my job. And then also creating dashboards so that the client can understand those numbers and put some context around it, and then make useful decisions from the data.
Do you also do if you're doing CRO, are you also making recommendations around what to do with the data tactically to see improvements in the end result?
Absolutely. We do a lot of A/B testing using Google Optimize primarily, just because it's free. And then, but even with Google Optimize or even any newsletter, are you tracking for clicks versus opens versus some other more important down the funnel conversion? And are you able to track that? And based on sample size, where will you get significant results from those different metrics? So all those considerations go into the recommendations I make to clients.
One of the things that's difficult about analytics is also you have to do instrumentation. You have to implement like probes, like to collect the data. And that requires a little bit of engineering to do. That can be quite difficult because as you mentioned, the client's experience is everywhere. It could be everywhere. Typeform, WordPress, in their CRM, the email, Gmail, everything. So how much access do you typically have in a client project to start going into their operations and start putting in tools, or using the tag manager, like to do it all from the outside? This is always a very interesting question for analytics agencies. Like, how do they get inside the client's stack?
Yeah, if I don't have access to the stack, and some clients are more hesitant than others, it's a very difficult job. So, I recently pulled Google Analytics tracking from within WordPress source code into Tag Manager, so I could do a cross-domain tracking plus some other more sophisticated data exploration. One thing that I typically like to do is you often don't know what the client will want down the road. So I try to add as many data analysis capability as I can easily do. There's a website called Bounteous, which has a bunch of Lunametrics recipes for Google Tag Manager, which makes things a lot easier. I also put in an event to track all forms across the site. And so that way, with that tracking in place, long term, you don't know what the client might want, but there's a good chance you'll have the data when they need it.
Interesting. And are you building out also portions of the funnel? Like if you want to run a campaign to do stuff, like are you like laying out websites and email tracking and email marketing, or like how far do you go on the implementation side for the CRO campaigns?
Pretty far. As far as talking with the salespeople about the conversation they'll be having with clients, I try to stay in the B2C world, but B2B can sometimes emerge from what originally seemed to be a B2C client. So B2B does become part of the package sometimes.
I'm like holding back because I could like talk to you endlessly about my own experience, but it sounds like you're also doing something similar. The great thing about starting with analytics is that you can see all the problems in the business, and it gives you a context to talk to the client about any kinds of problems. And as the wizard, it feels like you're the wizard when you're doing analytics. Like, see, this is the correlation, and this is what's happening. It's like, oh, I understood that about my customers, and then you're explaining to them. Then it becomes easy for you to sell solutions. And the problem I got into, and I'm curious how you're solving it or not, is that I kept saying yes to clients, and I went off-roading into things that were new to me. It was fun. I enjoyed the projects. Like I worked on a social network for moms, which is not even close to anything I should be doing anymore. I did sales operations for someone. I did like staffing, because all these things were related to the problems coming from analytics. It sounds like you're also doing a bunch of different kinds of projects for customers as well. Is that true?
Absolutely. I've been into some really weird roles in the past, trying to purchase Facebook groups back when you could pay $1 to get your first email delivered or your first message delivered through Facebook. I've been in all sorts of weird roles and learned weird tools, which is great because you can solve any problem. And I think that what you're sort of inferring there is a problem that I experienced myself, where if you kind of have the belief that you can do anything and you're open to any kind of client request, then you open yourself to having to relearn tool after tool, which is not a terribly scalable approach. So that's a lesson that I've been learning as my agency grows, and working to say no more and more often is something that I'm aspiring to.
The core idea now of this thing is, like, if the digital's not under control, your agency's not under control. And what does that mean? You're just selling human labor for money. Like, no matter how you package that up, there's a limit to how that can scale, because fundamentally you gotta keep throwing bodies in order to keep making money. And that's a treadmill of hell that agencies are on. It didn't used to be that way. We used to build out systems and maintain those systems. And that's kind of, I think, where the future will be again. But when you're doing totally new projects every time, you can end up having like really like random processes. So I'm curious, have you started building out like standard operating procedures to help bring some of these things under more management? Like, what are you doing to organize this?
Yeah, and I'll also speak to kind of the emotional sort of level of that as well, where a lot of what I do is working for startups who have maybe a very manual process, but want to streamline things using an email vendor, Zapier, etc., and other tools that I might not have experience with. And so I feel almost a compulsion to help them to be their one-man shop. because it doesn't make sense for them for a small startup to take on 5 different agencies, each specializing in their own area. So because I focus on smaller startups, there's almost like an unavoidable need to be a one-stop shop.
I mean, let's face it, you probably just enjoy it just as much as anything else. It's fun, isn't it?
There's a little bit of masochism that comes in there as well, for sure.
Yeah, it's a great thing about being, in this kind of position. You get to do really cool projects and test yourself. By the way, how long are you in client engagements typically? Like, are they short, like implementation projects, short term? Are you doing long term clients? Like, how are you packaging yourself up?
All long term. I just have no interest in continually pursuing new clients, getting transitioned onto their tools, and the rest of it with contracts, et cetera, and building trust. So all of my clients I've been with at least 1.5 years. The average age is about 4.5, 5 years.
So this is, I think, interesting. I mean, I don't know what the answer is. We'll find out. Always good with the interview when you don't know the answer to the question. What is the stickiness with the clients? Because if you're just like setting up Google Optimizer and building dashboards, your job is done and you're just reporting on it. That's just now you're back on the labor treadmill. But is there something that you're building up with the client, some kind of, I wouldn't say equity, but like some kind of nut around which you're like leveraging to keep the retainers going? Like, how are you building these long-term relationships beyond just selling more time?
Yeah, I become a fractional CMO. Essentially, they're CMO partner, but only working, an eighth of the time per client or something. And so they trust my recommendations. And I might say, like the service we're providing for you, it's just not providing ROI in terms of the cost of our labor, cost of their time, et cetera. And when you're working towards their best interests, it's a win-win because they trust you and want to empower you with additional budget to achieve their strategies.
Yeah, this is the thing. You're saying, I'll take care of it for you, meaning the marketing. And they can just like take that off their mind and trust you. And then, yeah, so that you put the operational loop through you, and you're doing, you've taken on the burden. Okay. So you're doing fractional CMO. Each client is different. How do you keep your mind organized? I think this is kind of like really key because when you're doing this kind of projects, like a lot of agencies can get trapped. Like, you don't know Monday to Tuesday what's happening, because you're switching client to client. How do you organize your mind?
We've been growing quite a bit, and it's been an increasing challenge to stay organized. We use FreshBooks for keeping track of time between different clients and different contractors. Yeah.
I started the marketing team there, so I'm happy that you're using FreshBooks. Yeah. That's good.
We use Asana very extensively, and sometimes my contractors, sometimes my clients will push back, and I continue to push pretty hard to make sure that we're communicating effectively, and that requires tools. And Asana is what I found to be the best project management tool. A little bit of Slack, but I find that it's distracting and it can just get a little bit overwhelming for me, so I've tried to avoid joining too many Slacks. Doing consistent weekly meetings with a pre-prepared agenda. The agenda, I'm kind of experimenting between different formats. I'll typically often have a spreadsheet that I bring into each of these weekly meetings to show progress with their relevant KPIs customized for each client. Also using Notion more and more for keeping track of documentation and kind of like projects as they proceed, as well as historical information. And then personally, I'm using Roam research to kind of keep track of my own internal knowledge base.
In your agency, it's just you, the full timer, but you have like a huge coterie of stringers, like freelancers, right? Is that right? Or do you work with other agencies? Like, how do you staff in and out of these projects?
Yeah, I'm doing more and more contracting my team out to agencies, acting as a white labeled subcontractor for advertising and more technical expertise, analytics implementations, etc. And then I subcontract out to largely just consultants not too often two agencies.
So, like when you're working with outsiders, knowledge transfer is a big deal. How long does it take to onboard a new consultant into a client project? What are you doing to make that efficient? Because I think that's it turned out to be an ongoing problem. Is like when you're using outside help to get them aligned to your processes. So, what are you doing there?
That's a huge challenge. I'm using Pantheon largely for our hosting service, which is a great safeguard when you're taking on a new contractor on the development side to ensure they're not messing things up and everything they do is reversible, that there's a process in place. Are you familiar with Pantheon?
I'm not. I'm actually Googling it right now.
Yeah, Pantheon's a great alternative to WP Engine. It's a bit restrictive in terms of how things work, where you have to install new plugins to the dev server. You can't do hotfixes to production, for example. And that's actually that's hard because a lot of developers aren't familiar with that more sophisticated development operations approach. But it ensures that if you do take on a new developer who maybe they have a specialized expertise that I didn't have in the rest of my other colleagues I work with, that as they start with a small project, that they can't. It's unlikely that they'll mess things up for everybody else. They've got multi-dev environments. It's a great tool, and I encourage anyone who does WordPress or Drupal development to check them out.
Actually, that's a good segue to like the last segment. And I know we in the pre we talked about Active Campaign, but actually I remember Pantheon. They're part of the trade association as well. You selected them over WP Engine for these reasons, but you're pretty deliberate about your choices of tools. And like the last constituency of this podcast, of course, all the SaaS vendors who are hungry to get work with agencies, but they don't know how you guys work, which is part of the point of this as well. How did you end up and why choosing Pantheon? Like, what was your process, would you say, to say, you know what, I trust this platform. It does solve the problems. I'm going to bring it to my clients and put it in front of them.
Sure. With Pantheon, I actually started using them because a partner agency that I was working with used them, and I got brought on into their ecosystem. But and maybe to answer your question better, so recently I was looking for comparing different email vendors, Active Campaign versus Mailchimp, Octopus, GetEmma, etc. And I had to try to figure out which one to go with for the particulars of a client's needs. Mm-hmm. And you've got these like different rating systems out there, which I don't typically find very useful to get an honest evaluation of how a tool will work for me. You can get some like basic information from them, the what's it called, G2, etc. But what I've actually found to be the most useful technique is going on to Google Groups. To Facebook groups and doing searches for whatever tool I'm looking at and seeing people's comments there. I just don't trust Amazon reviews, etc. They're all so easily gamed. I kind of expect the same thing with G2. So I've been trying to go for more organic approaches, even if they don't have the same, sample size. So I do that. And I also, when I'm trying to figure out a new tool, I do a lot of Active Campaign versus and seeing what Google prompts me with.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like the fact that you are doing your own research as if you're the customer as a partner, so to speak, or a shadow partner actually is what you are. The shadow partnership, the shadow channel, just for those who are not aware. So most agencies don't even bother joining the partnership program with the vendors because why would you want to be engaged? Waste your time talking to the software vendors every Monday. Like that's kind of what the partnership programs are. Usually most agencies are just, you're a plumber, right? You're just going to a hardware store and buying whatever valve is on the shelf and moving on with your life, right? That's most of the time, right? So in your buying behavior is similar to the customers, but of course your risk tolerance is lower because if you screw up in front of a client, that could be not just a one mistake, it could be your whole client engagement. And so you're doing this careful. So that's what the shadow channel is. Anyways, so in your case, similarly, you are effectively a shadow partner. Like you're not really. Are you in any partner program at all?
No.
Okay, so you're going around as a mystery customer, effectively, or looking around the organic stuff. Like, has anyone really blown you away with how they have built up a following amongst your peers that people that software vendors can go point to and say we should emulate that company because they're laudable? Do you have any recommendations.
The Facebook groups I look at the most often are like the ones for agency owners. And I believe that ClickUp is often referenced there. For a while there was one vendor, I can't remember the name at the moment, that their growth channel was to pay agencies to recommend them, and they all have that to a certain degree, but that was like one of the primary growth levers they were using, and it wasn't a great CRM. And so that word got around and everybody stopped using them. But in contrast, where you have a great product, word's going to get around, and that's the train that I'm going to jump on.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, ClickUp is definitely growing very quickly. My agency uses ClickUp, and it's nice to try the tool out. Is there any vendor who has, you don't have to name names, but has really disappointed you or caused problems with your clients? I'm also curious about those, because that's an area to improve as well.
Every tool has its challenges. From Google Ads support decreasing for the lower spend accounts. So every software has its issues, but in general, I've actually been pretty okay with the tools that I've used. Maybe that's, good due diligence and partially going where everyone's recommending I go.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, you're such a careful selector. That's very interesting that you've had a smooth ride once you've been careful about your diligence. It's a good lesson for other agency owners. I really appreciate you taking some time to talk through your practice of how you are building your agency. How do people get a hold of you?
Sure. Our website's our best place to get in touch, and that's piercingdigital.com, PIERCING digital.com.
Thank you for doing this. It was great meeting you actually at the cocktail party as well. And I hope to see you in person this year. I think things are finally opening up. So maybe I'll actually buy you a real drink. In real life. For more great insights on partnerships and software, like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.